Voter ID laws require eligible voters to show a valid ID at the polls when they go to vote. In the last 20 years, voter ID laws have been enacted and expanded in most states, and today, voters in these 35 states need to show some form of ID to vote. While voter ID laws differ from state to state, they can be put into some general categories. Some states require an ID which has a photo on it, like a driver's license, a military ID, or some other form of photo ID. But some other states also allow you to show non-photo ID, like a bank statement or a utility bill. Some voter ID laws are strict and require voters without adequate ID to vote on a provisional ballot and then return with a valid ID within a few days to have their ballot counted. Other voter ID states are less strict and have the option for some voters without ID to cast a ballot if they sign an affidavit or a poll worker vouches for them. 7 states fall into the strictest category, where voters must show photo ID on election day or come back with a photo ID within a few days. Where voter ID laws are enacted, advocates say they prevent voter impersonation fraud and voting by illegal immigrants and others who are not eligible to vote. They also say that reducing fraud will increase public trust in elections. These straightforward arguments seem to resonate with Americans, as the vast majority of adults support requiring voters to show photo ID at the polls. There is even majority support across political and racial lines. But as voter ID laws have spread across the country, so has opposition to them. Opponents argue that since not all people have an ID, these laws can reduce voter turnout, and that these laws disproportionately hurt low-income, minority, and elderly voters. They also argue that voter fraud is rare and does not justify reducing turnout. Proponents of voter ID laws argue that the laws don't reduce turnout and are therefore justified. So who's right about voter ID? Let's look at the prevalence of voter impersonation fraud, which is the kind of fraud voter ID laws prevent. There is ample evidence from independent research papers, court decisions, and government reports that voter fraud, and especially voter impersonation fraud, is incredibly rare. In fact, a person being struck by lightning is more common than voter impersonation. The Conservative Heritage Foundation keeps a detailed database of proven voter fraud, and they have found 16 cases of voter impersonation since 2004. In the same time frame, 1.3 billion legitimate votes were cast. An analysis by Professor Justin Levitt found only 31 credible allegations of voter impersonation from the year 2000 to 2014, a time frame in which 1 billion votes were cast. Voter fraud is extremely rare, but we should still want to prevent the little fraud that does occur if it doesn't have negative consequences. So do voter ID laws have a negative impact? Well, it's complicated. Around 10% of registered voters don't own a driver's license or a state ID, and minority voters are generally less likely to own an ID. In Texas alone, more than 500,000 registered voters lack valid ID. Black and Hispanic voters are less likely to have an ID than white voters. To combat the problem of eligible voters not having an ID, states often give out free IDs. But when getting a free ID, a person will still need to prove who they are by showing a birth or marriage certificate or some other proof of their identity. The direct cost of obtaining a driver's license is between $15 and $60, since a person needs to pay for identifying documents. Add on top of that the need to travel and wait at a DMV, and the total costs range from $75 to $175. Travel costs are disproportionately higher for rural Americans and minorities who on average live further away from DMVs and have worse public transit options. The elderly also have a harder time getting an ID, as their birth certificates sometimes don't match their current names. Some seniors were also born before record keeping of birth certificates became standard practice. So, do voter ID laws actually reduce turnout? Unfortunately, we just don't know. Election turnout changes from year to year, and finding out whether voter ID laws were the cause of a particular change in turnout is challenging. In 2014, the Government Accountability Office examined 10 studies about voter ID laws' effect on turnout. 5 studies found that ID requirements had no effect on turnout, 4 studies found decreases in turnout, and 1 study found that the laws actually increased turnout. The Accountability Office also did their own analysis of voter ID laws in Kansas and Tennessee. They found that the state's voter ID laws caused a 2 to 3 percentage point drop in turnout from 2008 to 2012. Turnout was disproportionately reduced among African American and young voters. The Secretary of State in Kansas, Tennessee, and Arkansas all disagreed with these findings. Newer studies can't agree on the effects of voter ID laws, with some finding that the laws reduce turnout, while others find that they have no measurable effect. Most studies agree that if voter ID laws reduce turnout, it is only by a few percentage points, and often not enough to change election outcomes. But turnout may be disproportionately decreased among minority voters. Overall, there is no definitive answer to whether voter ID laws reduce turnout. To conclude, most states have now enacted voter ID laws, with some states having stricter policies than others. Proponents argue that these laws will reduce voter impersonation fraud, but voter fraud is already extremely rare, and voter impersonation is rarer than being struck by lightning. A significant portion of eligible voters, especially poor, minority, and elderly voters, lack adequate ID, but states try to compensate for this by handing out free IDs. Nevertheless, obtaining an ID still costs money, disproportionately hurting rural, minority, and elderly voters, while especially placing a burden on the poor. Assessing whether voter ID laws reduce turnout is challenging. As a result, researchers have come up with different conclusions about these laws. If voter ID laws do reduce turnout, it's not by a large amount, and it likely doesn't have an impact on the outcome of most elections. But disadvantaged groups are hit the hardest. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you another time.